Trauma can occur anywhere, anytime, and to anyone. It takes on many forms: war, rape, crime, car accidents, and so on. To the onlooker, it might appear that a traumatic event has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But for those who have experienced it, the trauma just doesn't end. It becomes a part of them, an inescapable horror present throughout their daily lives, an endless, visceral reminder of their terror and their helplessness. And the body keeps the score. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's preeminent psychiatrists specializing in post-traumatic stress, reveals how traditional methods of therapy, talk therapy and medications, are limited in their effectiveness to treat trauma. He takes us step by step through the physiological effects of trauma and explains why the brain remembers trauma in a completely different way than it remembers everything else. Then, he takes us on a journey through holistic methods of treating trauma, methods that engage the body and the soul together in order to rewire the brain and provide relief from the devastating effects of post-traumatic stress. In this book summary, you'll learn why trauma continues to profoundly affect individuals long after the instant of trauma has passed, why it's essential that our systems of labeling and diagnosing trauma-based disorders continue to adjust and evolve with new research, and why traditional talk therapy and drug therapies must be supplemented with holistic healing methods such as EMDR, yoga, and even massage. Crucial quotes. Quote, "As human beings, we belong to an extremely resilient species. Since time immemorial, we have rebounded from our relentless wars, countless disasters, both natural and man-made, and the violence and betrayal in our own lives. But traumatic experiences do leave traces, whether on a large scale, on our histories and cultures, or close to home, on our families, with dark secrets being imperceptibly passed down through generations. They also leave traces on our minds and our emotions, on our capacity for joy and intimacy, and even on our biology and immune systems." Quote, "Everything about us, our brains, our minds, and our bodies, is geared toward collaboration in social systems. This is our most powerful survival strategy, the key to our success as a species, and it is precisely this that breaks down in most forms of mental suffering. It is important not to ignore the foundations of our humanity, relationships, and interactions that shape our minds and brains when we are young and that give us substance and meaning within our lives." Quote, "The fundamental issue in resolving traumatic stress is to restore the proper balance between the rational and emotional brains so that you can feel in charge of how you respond and how you conduct your life." Tweetable summary. Trauma rewires the brain, causing lingering, crippling flashbacks. It requires holistic treatment of the brain, the mind, and the body. Let's dive in to the big ideas. Big idea number 1. Recognize that traumatized individuals will often seem frozen in time, unable to move past the trauma and doomed to relive it. Quote, "Some people's lives seem to flow in a narrative. Mine had many stops and starts. That's what trauma does. It interrupts the plot." Unquote. Dr. van der Kolk starts off by telling us about the first day he realized that he would spend the rest of his career focused on helping people work through trauma. The day he met a Vietnam War veteran named Tom who, even after a decade in civilian life, found himself unable to truly escape the rice paddy where everyone in his unit had been violently killed. Tom had a wife, children, and a career, and he was terrified he would lose everything if he couldn't control his violent outbursts and drinking. Over the next 3 decades, Van der Kolk worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals of all races, all genders, and socioeconomic backgrounds with one thing in common. The trauma they had experienced was preventing them from living a normal life. While the traumatic event they had experienced was over, in their minds, they had never truly escaped that trauma, and they were forced to relive it over and over and over again, often triggered into recalling the event by ordinary moments, like hearing fireworks or hearing a baby cry or any other random trigger sound anchored into their nervous system. Now, the reason behind this is that the memories created during a traumatic event are not stored in the brain the same way as ordinary mundane memories are. So to demonstrate this, Van der Kolk offers up the findings of a study he conducted where he interviewed individuals who had experienced trauma and asked them to describe both a comforting memory and a traumatic one. The comforting memory was described in a narrative manner with a beginning and a middle and an end, like most stories, and the descriptions were largely free of strong, visceral emotions. Now, on the flip side, the traumatic experiences were described in flashes of sight, sound, and smell, with terror being described in terms of physical sensations, rapid breathing, frozen limbs, hearts pounding. Now, because these memories are so linked with the emotional side of the brain rather than the rational side of the brain, they're nearly impossible to control, and they can resurface at any time, causing the traumatized individual to constantly relive the experience in the same way that Tom relived his moments in the rice paddy, where all of his comrades were killed. Big idea number 2. During trauma, your brain's rational thought and analysis capabilities are disabled. Quote, Shakespeare captures this state of speechless horror in Macbeth. Oh, horror, horror, horror! Tongue nor heart can conceive nor name thee. Confusion now hath made his masterpiece. Unquote. During trauma, the parts of the brain responsible for rational thought and analysis are disabled. Now, this prevents a traumatized individual from being able to make rational sense of their experience. Van der Kolk experimented with this by scanning the brains of traumatized individuals as they relived their trauma through an induced flashback. The resulting scans showed how certain areas of the brain lit up during the flashback while other areas were just forced offline. He explains that the brain has 3 main parts, which all work together to first keep us alive, and second, allow us to function within our societal relationships. The human brain has evolved over the years to be more complex than the brains of any other species on Earth. But those parts that house our natural reptilian instincts are still extremely powerful. Now, your brain, and every human brain, operates from the bottom up. The brainstem, also known as the reptilian brain, comes first, and that controls our basic bodily functions, breathing, eating, sleeping, pooping, and peeing, what Van der Kolk labels the housekeeping. Right above the reptilian brain is what's known as the limbic system, also known as the emotional brain. And then finally, there is the prefrontal cortex, the youngest part of our brains, which is responsible for rational thought and analysis. This is what allows you to set goals and project into the future and think about things that you're going to do tomorrow. During any experience, we receive outside signals, which are taken in by our basic senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And those signals are sent to the various parts of our brains for interpretation. However, it takes longer for those signals to reach our prefrontal cortex, the smarter but younger part of the brain, than it does for them to reach our reptilian brain and limbic system. Therefore, during a high-stress event, such as trauma, which requires a more immediate response than other events, Sometimes the signals are not interpreted by our prefrontal cortex before our reptilian brain demands action. In these cases, the rational parts of our brains are just basically shorted out, and we have to resort to our reptilian brain to take action. Now, in the aftermath of this occurrence, the person who has experienced trauma is unable to bring their rational brain back online, so to speak, when it comes to remembering the event. And they're unable to rationalize and reason through their fear, which causes them to keep having irrational responses to flashbacks, essentially just freaking out over and over and over again every time they have a flashback, because they're not able to utilize their neocortex, that newer part of the brain that allows them to say, hey, okay, let's calm down. It's going to be okay. I'm just having a flashback right now. But instead, their reptilian brain kicks in and they just start freaking out. Big idea number 3. When your fight-flight response is thwarted during trauma, it can permanently elevate your stress and anxiety levels, which can lead to harmful adrenaline junkie type behavior. Quote, many traumatized people seem to seek out experiences that would repel most of us, and patients often complain about a vague sense of emptiness and boredom when they are not angry, under duress, or involved in some dangerous activity. Unquote. When a person's fight response has been thwarted during trauma, it can cause permanently increased levels of stress and anxiety, which can lead to dangerous, thrill-seeking type behavior. Now, Kolk shares a touching story of an encounter he had with a young boy who had witnessed the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. After seeing the planes fly into the building, the boy joined his classmates in running from their school, met up with his parents, and together they had returned home to process the experience. The next day, the boy drew a picture of the burning towers, complete with a trampoline at the bottom, so that the people falling from the towers would be able to land safely. Kolk was amazed at the calm, rational, and hopeful response of this young boy, but upon reflection realized that this response made sense. The boy had been able to physically run from the danger and had been soothed by his parents. Many people who experience trauma, though, aren't as lucky as the boy. Following trauma, their entire nervous system is altered to anticipate further attacks. They can't look into the future with hope or with resilience. Kolk theorizes that often this is because they lacked agency at the time of the traumatic experience. Whether it's because they were immobilized from fear or injury or held down, these individuals were made powerless. The stress hormones flooding their body at the time of the event were meant to help them either flee or fight. But when neither option was possible, those stress hormones failed to dissipate. In the aftermath, these individuals will often continue to seek out situations of high stress because this actually serves to soothe them. Some people become thrill seekers. Some, like a patient of Kolk's, return to situations where they will experience violence, such as becoming involved with violent pimps or with drug dealers. Big idea number 4. Traumatized people often return to the source of their trauma. Victims return to abusers, Army vets fantasize about returning to the violence of war, etc., etc. Quote, many traumatized people simply give up. Rather than risk experimenting with new options, they stay stuck in the fear they know. Unquote. Another result of the fight-flight response being thwarted is that traumatized individuals are unable to see any escape from their pain. Kolk describes the results of an experiment that involved administering painful electric shocks to dogs. First, the dogs were trapped in their cages while being shocked, but afterwards, they were shocked with the cage doors open. Dogs who had not been shocked before ran away, but the dogs with a history of having been shocked before just stayed there, even as they were in pain, even though the cage door was open and they could have ran away. After trauma, the whole world becomes hostile to the individual based on their perception. They walk through life under constant vigilance, waiting for someone else to hurt them. Because of this, they will feel sometimes safest while experiencing the original trauma that scared them and scarred them, because it's not as scary as the unknown is. Van der Kolk has documented that this occurs overwhelmingly in cases of domestic and/or child abuse. Abused children will almost always choose to remain with the caretakers that are abusing them. For them, while they're not safe at home, they're not safe anywhere. So why take the risk of a new situation? Big idea number 5. Learn how to predict a child's ability for healthy attachment and growth based on the relationship between that child and their primary caregiver. Quote, "The roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self-possessed other." Unquote. Our first lessons in self-care come from our being cared for. When we're born, we're typically swaddled, cuddled, fed, clothed, and generally attended to. Van der Kolk says that children whose parents are reliable sources of comfort and safety grow up with feelings of security that children with neglectful or abusive guardians just don't have. This is called attachment. And the more secure the attachment between the child and primary caretaker, usually mom and dad, the more resilience a child has. That is, the better they are able to bounce back in times of stress and strife. The caregiving must not only involve physical security, but also emotional attunement as well. The child learns and understands emotions from watching the caretaker and develops the organization of their emotional and rational brains accordingly. Children of neglectful or abusive guardians grow up with detached, disorganized brains and are often unable to control their emotional brains. Instead of feeling secure in the world, they feel terrified in it. And even if their caretakers scare them, the child will return to them again and again, fearing the unknown even more. This has extremely negative effects on communities and on our economic and judicial system, as these children have a much higher chance of missing out on educational opportunities and becoming involved with drugs and crime. Big idea number 6. The American Psychiatric Association's refusal to recognize developmental trauma disorder, DTD, prevents millions from accessing the resources they need. Quote, "Our brains are sculpted by our early experiences. Maltreatment is a chisel that shapes a brain to contend with strife, but at the cost of deep, enduring wounds. Childhood abuse isn't something you get over. It is an evil that we must acknowledge and confront if we aim to do anything about the unchecked cycle of violence in this country." Unquote. The children described in the aforementioned quote experience what Van der Kolk labels developmental trauma disorder, DTD. Untreated children with DTD often grow up struggling with drug and alcohol abuse, unsafe sexual activity, obesity, and crime. However, for many years now, DTD has been ignored by the American Psychiatric Association, who repeatedly ignored attempts by doctors like Van der Kolk to get the disorder registered in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. Now, the DSM guidebook informs politicians, hospitals, and insurance companies when it comes to diagnosing and treating mental disorders. And without a proper diagnosis, it can be almost impossible to get these children the support and treatment they need in order to overcome the trauma wrought by their early experiences. Furthermore, the U.S. government is failing to do its part to support families in order to ensure that more children are not being neglected or abused. Official programs in industrialized European countries, as well as experimental programs in the US that give young families financial and social support, such as regular home visits that teach young parents how to handle problems, have proven extremely effective when it comes to keeping children from developing DTD. The money spent on these programs is returned sevenfold when the crime rate, drug abuse rate, and STI infection rate drop. However, these programs continue to be rare in the United States. Kolk urges psychiatrists and politicians, and you too if you can, to do more to help these children. Big idea number 7. Recognize the limitations of traditional forms of both drug and talk therapy. Quote, no matter how much insight and understanding we develop, the rational brain is basically impotent to talk the emotional brain out of its own reality. Unquote. Now, Kolk is not suggesting that there's necessarily anything wrong with using either of these methods, talk or drug therapy, but he warns that they must be supplemented by other forms of therapy in order to truly reach the roots of the trauma. Now, because trauma affects our primitive and our emotional brains, attempting to treat it through rationalization isn't fully effective. Kolk shares an anecdote in which he was gently scolded by a patient of his own after he thoughtlessly told her that she should not feel guilty about her own abuse. She told Kolk that she could not help her emotional response and that being told it was wrong of her to respond that way only made her feel worse. Attempting to treat trauma through medication alone is also dangerous, because the drugs only temporarily alleviate or even just mask symptoms and do nothing to address the origins of the problems, the root cause. In addition, these drugs often dull both the positive and negative emotions alike, causing patients to miss out on the full spectrum of joys in life. Big idea number 8. Seek holistic treatments for trauma. Treatment that targets the brain, body, and mind in an effort to undo the drastic rewiring of the brain that occurs during trauma. Quote, trauma affects the entire human organism, body, mind, and brain. In PTSD, the body continues to defend against a threat that belongs to the past. Healing from PTSD means being able to terminate this continued stress mobilization and restore the entire organism to safety. Unquote. Trauma manifests itself within the body. People experiencing traumatic flashbacks almost always have intense physical reactions. They get flushed, they breathe hard, lash out violently, or simply shut down and go into a catatonic state. While the trauma begins in the brain and mind, it affects every part of the person. Therefore, treatment methods must treat every part of the person as well. Kolk says that effective therapy should involve 4 main steps. Note that there is no particular order and that these steps often overlap with one another. The first step is finding ways to be calm. Second step, finding methods to maintain that calm even when triggered with flashbacks and memories. Step 3, finding ways to be fully present and connected with others, also known as just being fully alive. Step 4, stop keeping secrets from yourself about the coping methods you have used to survive trauma. Physical actions and therapies teach people how to practice these steps by helping them be more mindful and pay more attention to bodily functions such as breathing. Yoga, Pilates, and martial arts are all very effective. Kolk has also experienced success with methods such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, which operates under the theory that rapid eye movement calms distress when a person is experiencing traumatic flashbacks. The baseline of these therapies is that they heal the mind through mindful manipulations of the body. In this way, they target the whole brain which results in the rational brain guiding the reptilian brain and emotional brain rather than losing control over them. Finally, no one treatment works for all people and all causes. While van der Kolk urges people to seek a licensed therapist to help guide them through trauma treatment, he warns them against trusting someone who claims to have one single cure-all, a blanket, so to speak, because they are more likely to be a closed-minded ideologue rather than a dedicated healer. Instead, seek help from someone who's committed to seeing you as a whole and unique person rather than just another disorder. Closing notes. The key takeaway from this book is this: the true tragedy of trauma is how it prevents people from fully living in the present and connecting with others in a healthy way. In order to effectively treat traumatized people, we've got to remember to take an approach that recognizes their unique situation and works to undo the damage to their brain, mind, and body at the time of the trauma. Here are some actionable insights. Understand that trauma treatment cannot be separated from politics. To do so would be to ignore that the origins of trauma are affected by and oftentimes rooted in things like income, family structure, housing, employment, and educational opportunities. If you seek to become involved in the treatment of trauma, you must do your research as to how our political and societal structures play their part. Do not rely on anything as a cure-all. Traditional talk therapy or medications alone are not sufficient when it comes to getting to the root of trauma. Every individual case must be approached with a fresh eye and open mind. And finally, make sure that trauma treatments are based in social structures. Humans are irrevocably social animals, and healing must happen in the context of relationships.